My brother Bennett walked into our father's office with a forged folder of financial records designed to make it look like I had stolen from our family hardware store, to cover the money he had secretly been embezzling to pay off his own debts. My name is Miriam Achebe, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. The first thing I noticed when my father asked me to come into the office after closing was that he did not say why. That alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. My father, Emmanuel Achebe, never wasted words when the family business was involved. He believed in clarity, in order, in knowing exactly where every dollar went and who touched it along the way. He had built our hardware store from a cramped rented storefront into one of the most reliable family businesses in the neighborhood, and because of that history, he treated any discussion about money like a matter of honor. Not just accounting. Honor. So when he told me to come to his office and bring my ledger keys, my access codes, and my notebook, I knew something serious was waiting for me. I locked up my desk at the back counter, handed the evening register to Rosa, who had been with us for 15 years and knew the rhythm of the place better than anyone, and walked toward the office at the rear of the store. The aisles around me still carried the after-hours smell of sawdust, metal brackets, fertilizer bags, and the faint rubber scent from the stack of hoses near the loading bay. The overhead lights were already dimmed, and only the strip above the paint counter was still bright enough to cast long reflections across the polished floor. My brother Bennett was already inside. That should have made me suspicious immediately, but at the time I only felt a tired kind of irritation. Bennett and I worked together every day, and for the most part our roles were cleanly divided. I managed the books, payroll, invoice reconciliation, and bank deposits. Bennett handled purchasing, vendor relationships, and special orders. We had worked that way for years. It was efficient, and when we were careful, it was stable. Lately, though, Bennett had been tense. Not openly cruel or reckless. Not enough that father would have noticed on the surface. Just restless. Shorter with employees. Hovering too long over the supplier calls. Laughing too loudly when customers asked about delivery delays. I had chalked it up to pressure. Business pressure. Personal pressure. Bennett had always had the easier charm, the smoother way with people. But he also had a habit of spending like every month was a celebration. New shoes, expensive dinners, a used truck he kept sinking money into even though the old one still ran fine. I had told him more than once that if he was under strain, he should stop pretending everything was fine and say so. He had always waved that off. When I stepped into father's office, I saw the folder spread across his desk before he even spoke. Bennett sat in one of the chairs in front of the desk, hands clasped, posture carefully controlled. Father stood behind the desk instead of sitting, which meant he was already angry, or trying not to be. He looked at me and said, "Sit down, Miriam." I did. He slid the folder forward. "Bennett brought me something that needs to be addressed." I opened it, expecting maybe a vendor dispute, a missing receipt, a weird overpayment from a customer. Instead, I found printouts, spreadsheet summaries, copies of bank transfer records, highlighted entries in yellow, a neat stack of annotated statements with arrows and handwritten notes in Bennett's cramped, deliberate handwriting. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. Then I did. The folder was built like a case file, and the case was against me. There were irregular payments to a supplier named Dalka Building Materials. There were duplicate entries in the ledger, apparently showing reimbursements issued from the business account to the same vendor invoices. There were cash withdrawals tied to dates when I had signed off on deposits. There were mismatched entries between inventory received and inventory paid for, and threaded through all of it were Bennett's notes, calmly implying that because I had access to bookkeeping systems, only I could have created the discrepancies. I looked up slowly. "What is this?" Father's face was hard, but I could see the strain under it. "Your brother says there are financial inconsistencies. He believes there may have been misuse of store funds. By me?" No one answered right away. Bennett cleared his throat, not looking at me. "I didn't want to bring this up, Miriam, but the numbers kept not matching. I checked the vendor statements, and some of the receipts don't line up with the deposits." I stared at him. It was such an obvious lie that for a second I honestly thought I had misheard him. He kept his eyes on the folder. "I know you handle the books. I'm not accusing you lightly. I just think we need to take a closer look." I could feel my face getting hot. "You think we need to take a closer look? You came in here with a prepared file." Father's hand came down flat on the desk, not a slam, but enough to silence both of us. "Miriam, answer the question. The question. Not, are these documents real? Not, how long has this been going on? Not, Bennett, where did you get these? Just answer the question, as if I had already been found guilty and now needed only to explain myself in a way that made sense to him. I looked back down at the papers and started reading more carefully. That was when I saw the subtle things. Duplicate formatting on one invoice that should have come from an outside vendor. A sequence of transfer dates that made no business sense. A reimbursement code that should have been used for store mileage expenses, not inventory orders. Even without digging deep, it felt wrong, not just suspicious. Constructed. I looked up again. This is not real. Bennett frowned, playing offended. Excuse me? These summaries are cherry-picked. Some of these entries aren't even from the same reporting period. And this line here, this vendor credit, the payment date doesn't match the actual delivery date. It's stitched together. Father turned to Bennett. Did you verify this before bringing it to me? I did, Bennett said quickly. Too quickly. I spent nights checking it. I didn't want to say anything unless I was sure. That was the moment I understood he had prepared for this. The folder was too neat. The timing was too convenient. The story already had a shape. I sat back in the chair and forced myself to breathe. Dad, I have not taken a cent from this store. His expression did not soften. Then explain the discrepancies. I'm looking at them for the first time. That is not an explanation. I almost laughed from disbelief. Not because it was funny, but because the whole thing was so absurd that my mind wanted to throw it out as if it were a bad dream. I had worked in that store since I was old enough to reach the bottom shelf of the inventory bins. I had spent college breaks entering receipts by hand, then later built the accounting system we now used. I knew where every supplier statement went, how every deposit was tracked, how every refund was coded, and which employee had access to what. I was meticulous because I knew my father. He trusted work, not excuses. If a figure was off by $5, he would hunt it down until he found out why. And now he was looking at me like I might have done the one thing I always took pains not to do. I turned one of the pages around and pointed to a highlighted line. This invoice is off. The quantities are too clean. Real vendor paperwork doesn't look like this. Bennett's jaw tightened. Are you saying I forged it? I stared at him. I'm saying something is wrong and I didn't create it. Father rubbed one hand over his mouth. I knew that gesture. It meant he was trying not to let his disappointment show too early. Miriam, he said more quietly, if there is a problem, this is your chance to tell me the truth before it gets worse. I felt something sharp and cold settle in my chest. It was not anger yet. It was the first hard shape of betrayal. I am telling you the truth, I said. Bennett finally looked at me, and there it was. Not guilt, not regret. Something harder and uglier. A warning. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he knew that if Father believed him, he would have the opening he needed. I pushed the folder back. I need time to review the actual records, not this summary. Father frowned. You're asking for time after this has already been brought to my attention. I'm asking because if you want accuracy, I need the full system access, the unedited vendor files, the bank reconciliation logs, and the transaction history. Not a folder Bennett assembled to make a point. Bennett's eyebrows rose. So now this is about me. It's always been about you. I snapped before I could stop myself. Then immediately regretted the tone because Father's eyes hardened again. He inhaled slowly, the way he did when he was trying to keep a situation from splitting open. Enough. Miriam, you will step away from the books until we know what is going on. The words hit harder than I expected. Step away. Not because he had found proof. Not because there was an investigation. Because Bennett had placed a folder in front of him, and I was the one with the keys. I wanted to argue. I wanted to point out that Bennett handled purchasing, that he signed off on vendors, that he had as much opportunity as I did to move numbers around if the numbers were being moved. I wanted to remind Father that this store had survived because I had built systems he barely had time to understand. But I also knew something else. If I shouted, I would look defensive. If I begged, I would look guilty. So I did the only thing I could do. I stood up, met Father's gaze, and said, I want a complete independent audit. Bennett's head turned toward me so fast I could almost hear the motion. Father frowned. What? A full audit. Not an internal review. Not Bennett checking the books he thinks I touched. An outside forensic accountant. Someone with no stake in this family and no reason to protect anyone. Bennett scoffed. That's dramatic. It's accurate, I said. Father was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the folder, then at Bennett, then at me. I could practically hear him weighing the cost. Not just the money, the embarrassment, the ripple through the store, the way neighbors would talk if they learned the family had accused its own bookkeeper of theft. Finally, he said, If I agree, and the audit shows you took money, you understand what that means. I did. If he agreed, and I was guilty, I would lose more than my job. I would lose the standing I had spent my whole life building inside my own family. But I had never been more certain of anything in my life. I understand, I said. And if the audit shows Bennett fabricated these discrepancies, then you'll understand what that means too. That made Bennett angry enough that his face changed. Just for a second. He covered it quickly, but I saw it. He was not prepared for me to push back this hard. Father motioned toward the door. Go home, Miriam. We'll speak tomorrow. Go home. As if the floor beneath me had not shifted. As if my own brother had not just tried to turn me into a thief in front of my father. I walked out of the office with my back straight, because that was the only thing I could control. Once I got to the parking lot, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes with my hands on the steering wheel and my eyes fixed on the store's glowing sign, trying to think through what had just happened. My first instinct was still disbelief. My second was fear. Bennett was careless, yes, but this was not careless. He had spent time organizing a file, timing his accusation, and shaping Father's reaction. That meant he had something to hide. Something larger than a few bad purchases or personal debt. By the time I got home, I knew I needed help. I did not call my father. I did not call Bennett. I called an attorney. Her name was Priscilla Nakamura, and she had a reputation for being the kind of lawyer people only called when they already knew the situation was ugly. I had met her once at a business networking event, and remembered her because she listened more than she spoke, which in my experience usually meant she was dangerous in the best possible way. When she heard me explain the situation, she did not interrupt until I was finished. Then she said, "Do not argue this case emotionally. Build it factually." I sat at my kitchen table under the yellow light and wrote down every date I could remember that seemed relevant. When Bennett had been acting strange, which vendor invoices had felt off. When he had asked me to authorize a temporary vendor payment because the supplier was waiting on clearance, and when he had started taking phone calls outside the store with the same low, urgent voice he used when he was trying to keep a secret from Father. Priscilla asked questions that were almost annoyingly precise. Who had access to the accounting software? Who could create credit memos? Who controlled vendor relationships? Who approved payments? Who could view bank statements? By the end of the call, I had a list of gaps, and the list was not reassuring. Bennett controlled supplier communication. He could request new invoices. He had access to purchase order generation. He often hand-delivered paper invoices to me after meeting with vendors, which meant if he wanted to nudge a number before I entered it, he had the opportunity. I had the books. He had the story. Priscilla told me to preserve everything and not touch the records except through formal channels. She said if I wanted to protect myself, I needed the kind of audit that could stand up in court. "Do you know a forensic accountant?" she asked. "No. I do." That was how Cornelius Achebe entered the story. He was not a relative, despite the surname. The name is common enough in our extended community that people often assume a connection where there is none. Cornelius specialized in financial tracing, especially in small businesses where family ties made dishonesty harder to spot and easier to excuse. He was calm in a way that made people tell him too much, and when Priscilla introduced us, I immediately understood why she had recommended him. He came to the store 2 days later in a plain gray suit with a leather satchel that had obviously seen years of use. He did not waste time on sympathy or small talk. He introduced himself to Father, nodded once to Bennett, and asked to see the original records. Father had agreed to the audit, though not without visible reluctance. That alone made the atmosphere in the store feel like a storm pressing against glass. Customers could sense tension, even if they did not know its source. Employees lowered their voices. Rosa watched everyone with the kind of sharp attention that meant she had already guessed more than anyone had said out loud. Cornelius set up in the small conference room off the office, where we usually held vendor meetings or quarterly reviews. For 3 days, he sat under fluorescent lights with stacks of invoices, bank statements, receipts, purchase orders, and inventory logs spread out around him like a paper city. He asked for printouts and digital exports. He asked for login history. He asked for vendor contact details and payment approval logs. He asked for the reconciliation notes I had written by hand because I had always believed in having a paper trail behind the software trail. Each question made Bennett look more annoyed. At first, Bennett acted cooperative. He would bring in files with a tight smile and say things like, "See, I'm trying to help," as if he were the wronged party volunteering to clear things up. But as Cornelius dug deeper, Bennett became visibly rattled. I noticed it in small ways. He stopped hovering near the conference room. He took longer smoke breaks even though he had supposedly quit a year earlier. He started asking me weird, unnecessary questions about whether I had changed any passwords or exported any reports recently, as if he wanted to know how much I had already seen. I answered everything with as little emotion as possible. That was harder than it sounds. We still had to work together. Orders still came in. Customers still needed help. Contractors still needed estimates on shingles, screws, lumber, and power tools. The store still smelled like fresh-cut cedar and machine oil in the mornings. Life kept moving even while the floorboards felt unsteady underneath us. Bennett and I passed each other at the register. We handled calls from vendors who had no idea anything was wrong. We smiled at customers asking about patio lights or drywall anchors. We pretended we were simply busy. At home, I barely slept. I kept replaying the meeting in Father's office, searching for details I had missed. Why had Bennett prepared the file so carefully? Why had he seemed almost relieved when Father looked disappointed in me? Why had he chosen to accuse me instead of asking Father for help with whatever was clearly crushing him? If he had simply admitted he was in trouble, Father might have been angry, but he would have helped. That was the kind of man he was. Strict, yes. Hard to please, absolutely, but not cruel. Our family could weather hardship. What it struggled to survive was shame, and Bennett knew that. Cornelius asked to review the vendor payment history for the last 18 months. He wanted the original invoices from Dalka Building Materials, the purchase orders tied to them, and the bank records for every transfer made to that supplier. I pulled them. The first thing I noticed was that the invoices had unusual consistency. Amounts were rounded in a way that real supply orders rarely are. Delivery dates clustered around the same days each month, even though our actual inventory movement was irregular. Some line items were too generic, like miscellaneous construction materials or contractor supplies, which was not how Dalka usually itemized goods. I had dealt with enough vendors to know that even a sloppy supplier had some personality in their paperwork. These invoices felt like someone trying to imitate real paperwork without understanding the ordinary messiness of it. Cornelius noticed the same thing. He asked me a question I remember exactly because of how quiet he was when he asked it. Has Bennett ever handled payment negotiations himself? I thought about it. Yes, mostly with Dalka. He said he had a good relationship with their sales rep. Cornelius looked up slowly. Did you ever speak to that sales rep directly? Only once or twice. Did you ever verify pricing independently? Not every invoice. I checked totals and delivery logs, but vendor pricing changes seasonally. Bennett usually handled that side. He nodded as if that confirmed something he had suspected. Then he said, people who stage false records often rely on the other person assuming a vendor relationship is real because the paperwork looks plausible. They hide inside ordinary complexity. I did not answer. I could feel a knot tightening in my throat. By the end of the first week, Cornelius had identified enough anomalies to justify a deeper trace. He found that several of the disputed payments were not actually missing money in the sense Father feared. They were inflated payments. Overcharges had been approved on invoices Bennett had submitted. Then the excess had been moved through a series of accounts that tied back, indirectly at first, and then more clearly, to Bennett's personal obligations. Not all at once. That would have been too simple. Instead, the money had been routed through a pattern of vendor overbilling, partial cash withdrawals, and short-term transfers that looked legitimate if you did not know what you were searching for. It was an elegant fraud. A small business fraud. The kind that exploits trust more than technology. And that meant Bennett had not just been spending beyond his means. He had been hiding debt. The second week of the audit was harder than the first because Cornelius began asking for things I had not yet wanted to imagine. Personal records, communication logs, names of suppliers Bennett contacted directly, payment instructions attached to email threads, text confirmations, internal notes. Priscilla told me to keep my distance from the emotional part of it and let the evidence do the talking. That advice saved me, because once I started seeing the shape of Bennett's pattern, the betrayal became more layered and more ugly. He had been borrowing from the future of the store to cover his present self. He had apparently accumulated personal debts through a mix of bad bets, consumer spending, and one loan he had failed to disclose when asked. Instead of telling Father, he had looked for a way to quietly replace that hole with money from the business. But rather than just steal outright, he had engineered a supplier scheme that gave him plausible deniability and let him point the finger somewhere else if anyone noticed. Somewhere in that process, he decided I would be the useful target. Probably because I was the one who touched the books, probably because I was quieter, probably because I had spent so long being the careful one that people would be quicker to believe I might have hidden something than they would be to believe Bennett had engineered a fraud. That realization hurt more than the money. It meant he had looked at our family and chosen the sister most likely to be sacrificed. I started seeing his behavior differently in memory. The times he had asked me to delay entering a vendor credit because he was waiting on a corrected invoice. The way he had started insisting on paper copies instead of email confirmations. The way he had once said, almost jokingly, "You know Dad would blame you first if anything ever went wrong in the numbers." At the time I had rolled my eyes and ignored it. Now those comments felt like test runs. He had been laying groundwork. One afternoon, while Cornelius was deep in the records, Priscilla called me into the hallway outside the conference room. "I want to be very clear," she said, "because you're going to hear this from me before anyone else tries to spin it. We have enough preliminary evidence to say Bennett is the likely source of the discrepancies, but I need something stronger than tracing money on paper. I need proof of intent or coordination." "A vendor contact?" I asked. "Possibly. Or a witness. Or communications that show an arrangement." I nodded, feeling suddenly tired. She looked at me carefully. "Do you have any idea who at Dalca would be the relevant person?" I thought of the invoices, the calls Bennett took outside, the times he had returned with that satisfied, secretive look. "There's a rep named Victor Dalca," I said slowly. "I've never dealt with him directly, but Bennett used his name a lot." Priscilla wrote it down. "Then that's where we go next." The investigator she brought in was Marisol Vance. And unlike Cornelius, who felt like a scalpel, Marisol felt like a lockpick. She was sharp-eyed, patient, and willing to sit with silence until someone else filled it. She specialized in business and domestic financial fraud, and she had the unnerving habit of remembering details people had already forgotten they had mentioned. Cornelius had already given her the outline. She took the outline and started finding the human weaknesses inside it. Marisol spent 2 days reviewing vendor communications, then drove out to meet people who had no reason to know their answers mattered. She talked to a former Dalca employee, then to a delivery supervisor, then to a receptionist who remembered seeing Bennett come in through the side entrance more often than a normal buyer would. She did not tell me exactly what method she used, but when she returned, she had the look of someone who had found the seam in a wall. She said, "Your brother wasn't just overpaying invoices, he was working with someone at the vendor." I felt my pulse jump. "How sure?" "Very." She spread several printed pages across the table. There were copied email headers, meeting notes, phone logs, and one particularly damning chain of text messages that showed Bennett discussing invoice amounts in language that made no sense unless both sides understood there would be an overage to divide. No explicit admission. Nothing stupid enough to be a confession, but enough. The kind of pattern that made a lie look like what it was. Marisol pointed to one message. "Look here," he writes, "same structure as last time. Keep the rest in the usual place. That isn't a purchase order note. That's a kickback note." I felt physically ill. The words hit like a slap because they confirmed something I had been circling for days but still hoped would turn out less ugly. Bennett had not acted alone. He had arranged with a cooperative supplier to inflate invoices, overpay the store, then receive a portion of the excess as a personal return. A kickback scheme, the oldest ugly trick in the book. Simple in design, corrosive in practice. And he had used me as cover. He had taken the one thing father valued most, the family reputation for honesty, and turned it into camouflage. Marisol's findings also explained why the numbers in the folder had looked so polished. Bennett had likely chosen actual discrepancies created by his own scheme, then repackaged them as signs of embezzlement by me. He had been the source of the financial damage and the architect of the accusation. The man had not merely lied. He had weaponized paperwork. I asked Marisol one question that kept echoing in my head. Why would he risk bringing this to father, unless he was desperate? She leaned back and folded her arms. Because desperate people don't always choose the cleanest story. They choose the story that buys them the most time. That sounded right in a way I hated. The next few days in the store became unbearable in small, almost invisible ways. We all kept working. That was part of the cruelty of it. Fraud does not pause for grief. Inventory still needs counting. Customers still ask whether a certain drill bit comes in half-inch. Vendors still call about account balances. Delivery trucks still back into the loading bay. And inside that motion, I had to stand beside Bennett and pretend that every casual exchange was still ordinary. He would ask, "Did you send the bank reconciliation?" I would say, "Yes." He would ask, "Have you heard from the accountant?" I would say, "Not yet." He never once said, "I'm sorry." He never once asked if I was okay. Instead, he watched me with that same guarded expression, like he was waiting to see whether I would explode before his plan was finished. Rosa noticed the tension before anyone else said it aloud. One afternoon she caught me at the end of the paint aisle while I was restocking shelf tags. "You all right?" she asked quietly. I almost lied. Instead I told her, "No." She nodded once, as if that was the only honest answer available. Thought so. Your brother's been acting strange for months. I looked up. What kind of strange? She shrugged. Calls in the parking lot. Paperwork he doesn't want the rest of us to see. Short temper with suppliers on days he's usually smooth. The kind of man who smiles too hard when he's trying to look normal. I leaned against the shelf for a second. Why didn't you say anything? Because families don't always want to hear what workers notice. She gave me a long look, and because I've worked here long enough to know when one of the children is about to become the scapegoat. That nearly made me cry, which was inconvenient because I was standing between the exterior screws and the adhesive section with a customer 2 aisles over. Still, I thanked her. Her confirmation mattered, not because it added hard evidence, but because it validated the pattern. Bennett had not simply become erratic recently. He had been acting like someone managing a secret long before he decided to accuse me. The accusation was not a response to discovery. It was a defense mechanism. Cornelius kept working through the final reconciliation, and the more he sorted, the more complete the picture became. Every disputed amount had an origin. Every missing payment had a trail. Every trail led away from me and back toward Bennett's transactions. By the time he finished the written report, he was no longer hypothesizing, he was documenting. The final report was thick enough to change the atmosphere in a room just by being present. Priscilla read it first, then Marisol's supplement, then the vendor correspondence, then the bank routing histories, the email timestamps, and the payment authorizations. When she finally looked up at me, her expression had shifted from professional focus to something gentler. "He did this," she said. It was not a question. I nodded once. "And he built it to make you look like the only person who could have done it." "Yes." She closed the report and sat back. "Then we go to your father." I had been dreading that part ever since the first meeting, not because I thought he would reject the evidence. By then the evidence was far too strong. I dreaded it because I knew what it would mean for him as a father. The private meeting took place in the same office where I had first been accused, but this time the folder on the desk did not belong to Bennett. It belonged to the truth. Father was already there when I arrived, looking older than I remembered him looking a week before. The lines around his mouth were deeper. He had not slept well. He had probably convinced himself that he would be hearing a misunderstanding, not a betrayal. Bennett was also there. I had not expected that. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, posture stiff. When he saw me, he gave me a tight, unreadable expression that I immediately hated. Father gestured for us to sit, but I stayed standing. I could not have sat if I tried. My pulse was too loud. Priscilla opened with the facts. No drama, no speculation. Just the audit trail. She explained the invoice inflation, the abnormal vendor payment patterns, the transfer sequences, the personal debt pressure, and the supporting communications Marisol had gathered. Marisol followed with the vendor relationship evidence. She described the meetings, the phone calls, the wording in the messages that indicated Bennett and Dalka were coordinating the overbilling arrangement. Cornelius then walked Father through the ledger. He showed him how Bennett's supposedly suspicious numbers had actually been the artifacts of Bennett's own scheme. He demonstrated that the accounts Bennett had pointed to as evidence of my theft were the exact places where his kickback pattern appeared. He explained how the timing of the invoices corresponded to Bennett's cash flow problems, not to any pattern of misconduct on my part. Father listened without moving. I watched his face slowly change. At first there was confusion, then disbelief, then a kind of quiet devastation that looked almost physical, as if someone had struck him in the chest and he was waiting for the breath to return. He kept turning pages, pausing at the same lines again and again, as if he looked long enough the meaning would change. Finally, he set the report down and looked at Bennett. His voice was low. "Tell me this is not what it looks like." Bennett did not answer. That silence was answer enough. Father looked back at the documents, then at me. The hurt in his face made my throat burn, because beneath everything else, beneath the anger and the betrayal and the humiliation, I could see the part of him that had genuinely believed he was protecting the business from theft. He had believed the child who came to him with a prepared accusation. He had accepted the story because it fit his fear, that money had been stolen and one of his own children had done it. Now the truth was worse. Now he had to face the fact that he had almost condemned the wrong child. "Bennett," he said again, and this time the words cracked. Bennett finally spoke. "I can explain." I almost laughed, but the sound died in my chest. He could explain. That was the brilliance and ugliness of it. People like Bennett always thought the issue was explanation. Not truth, not accountability, Explanation. A smoother narrative, a softer landing. Father asked, "Were you taking money from the business?" Bennett looked at the floor. "Answer me." The room went so quiet I could hear the paper edge against the table when Cornelius shifted one report to the side. Finally, Bennett said, "I was trying to fix it." Father's expression changed as if he had not heard correctly. Fix what? My debts. There it was. Not the whole truth, but enough to set the stone rolling. Bennett's voice started to rise, as though the confession itself was an insult to his pride. "I had things under control until last year, and then the payments got bigger, and the interest kept compounding, and I just needed time. I wasn't stealing to hurt anyone. I was going to pay it back." I stared at him in disbelief. He actually said the words as if they were protective, as if intent mattered more than action, as if "I was going to pay it back" erased the entire chain of deceit. Father planted both hands on the desk and leaned forward. "And Miriam?" Bennett's jaw tensed. He did not answer immediately, which was all the answer anyone needed. Father's face drained of color. "You accused your sister." Bennett finally looked up, and for one brief second I saw something in him that was not charm or anger or calculation. It was naked panic. He had not expected the room to tilt this far against him. He said, "I had to protect the store." The words were so offensive I had to take a step back. Father barked a sharp, broken laugh. "Protect the store by lying about your sister?" "I knew if I blamed the discrepancies on her access, we could get control of the situation before it got out," Bennett said, voice rushing now, the excuses spilling faster than he could organize them. "I was handling the vendor side. She was the one in the books. It made sense. I panicked." There it was again. Panic. The favorite shelter of people who do damage and want mercy without the expense of honesty. I looked at him then and felt something in me settle, not because the pain was gone. It was not. But because whatever part of me had hoped he might still be confused or cornered or only half responsible was gone now. He had made a choice. He had chosen me. He had chosen to let Father think I was a thief rather than admit he had buried himself in debt and fraud. Father walked around the desk as though he needed space to keep from collapsing under it. He stopped a few feet from Bennett and looked at him for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, which somehow made it worse. "You came to me with evidence against your sister." Bennett swallowed. "You sat in my office and watched me accuse her." Bennett said nothing. "You let me believe she had betrayed this family." The silence that followed felt endless. I could see the exact moment Father understood the deeper insult. Bennett had not just stolen from the business. He had used the family itself as a shield. He had turned a brother-sister relationship into a smokescreen. He had exploited Father's values against him, knowing honesty would be rewarded too late and deceit might buy him enough time to survive, and now there was nowhere left to hide. Father pointed toward the door. "Out." Bennett blinked. "Dad. Out." The word landed like a hammer. Bennett looked at me, and I think he expected something from me then. Anger. Pleading. Maybe even forgiveness. I gave him nothing. He left the office with his shoulders stiff and his face pale, and once the door shut behind him, Father sat down hard in the chair he had previously refused to take. For a moment he said nothing. I had seen him angry many times. I had seen him disappointed, stressed, frustrated, stubborn. I had never seen him look beaten. "Miriam," he said finally, and there was so much pain in it that I almost couldn't answer. "I know." He lifted his eyes to mine. I should not have believed him so quickly. I did not tell him he was right, because that would have been too easy and too false. He was the father in a family business where one child had come with organized proof and the other was the bookkeeping daughter with a reputation for precision. He had believed the son who seemed worried, helpful, and pressed for answers. He had believed the shape of the accusation because it matched the fear in his head. That was human. But it had still hurt. I said, "You wanted to protect the store." He nodded once, then covered his eyes with one hand. He looked suddenly much older than his years. Priscilla laid out the legal steps next. Bennett would be removed from authority over vendor relations immediately. His access to payment systems would be revoked. The forensic report and Marisol's findings were enough to support formal legal action if Father chose to pursue it. Restitution would be required. Depending on how much was proven and whether the vendor involved cooperated, there could be civil consequences and possibly criminal exposure. Father listened with a grim expression. I wanted to ask him what he planned to do. I wanted to know whether he would try to handle it quietly, whether he would shield Bennett out of some misplaced loyalty, whether he would make me carry the burden of keeping the peace one more time. But I also knew I would not accept that anymore. Not after this. In the end, he said, "We will do this properly." That was his way of saying he had chosen not to bury it, and in this family that meant something. The next few days were some of the hardest I have ever lived through. Bennett did not come to work. Father put the store manager, Rosa, in temporary charge of operational oversight while he handled the legal side with Priscilla. Bennett's office was cleaned out. His access was cut. The vendor contacts were notified that all financial communication would now go through Father and me together, with a second signature requirement on anything above a strict threshold. I expected relief. What I felt instead was a strange exhaustion, like my body had been holding itself upright through sheer force and now could not remember how to relax. People in the store whispered, "Of course." They always do when something big cracks open in a family business. Some of them knew enough to be careful. Others knew less but guessed more. I caught fragments of conversation near the register, in the stockroom, by the contractor counter. I heard there was fraud. No, I heard it was one of the children. Which one? No one guessed Bennett right away. That was almost funny. What hurt more was that I now understood why. I had always been the reliable one in people's eyes. Reliable people are not usually the first suspects in a story unless someone makes a very strong case. Bennett, on the other hand, had the easier smile, the louder voice, the better instinct for looking like he was in control. He looked like someone who would notice a problem and fix it, not someone who would invent a lie to escape it. He had counted on that. The irony was unbearable. A week after the confrontation, Father asked me to come into his office again. This time there was no folder on the desk, just a cup of untouched tea and a silence that felt less like an ambush and more like a confession trying to find its way out. He gestured for me to sit, and I did. "I keep going over it," he said. "The audit? No. That first meeting." I waited. He folded his hands together. "I should have asked for more before I reacted. But I saw the numbers and I saw your brother's concern, and I convinced myself the simplest explanation was the right one. I looked at the desk surface because it was easier than looking at his face." "You believed him," I said. He nodded. "Yes." The honesty in that answer mattered. He went on. "I believed him because I thought he had brought me a painful truth. I did not expect him to bring me a lie wrapped around a coward's escape. I let that sit between us." Then he said, "I am sorry." It was a difficult apology to hear because it could not undo anything, but I knew he meant it, and in our family that was not a small thing. I finally looked up. "I'm not only hurt that you believed him, I'm hurt that he knew you might." Father's mouth tightened. "He knew exactly what to exploit," I said. "He knew my access would make me look guilty if he gave you enough paper." "I know. He knew the store mattered more to you than pride." Father lowered his gaze. That part was true too. He had built his life around that store. Every wall, every shelf, every delivery schedule, every seasonal promotion. It was not just a business, it was our family's anchor. Bennett understood that if he framed the accusation as a question of protecting the store, Father would react before he fully thought it through. And he had. The legal process unfolded quietly after that, but not without consequences. Priscilla handled the formal filings. Bennett retained counsel of his own, though from what I heard he spent the first several days in a defensive spiral, insisting he only meant to buy time and that the supplier was the real problem. That argument did not help him. Marisol's work made the supplier side impossible to ignore. Victor Dalka was not a naive bystander. He had participated knowingly in the overbilling arrangement, and once the paper trail was presented, he had to decide whether to cooperate or take his own risks. I was not present for every stage of that process, but I know enough to say that once his side started shifting, Bennett's story collapsed faster than he expected. The restitution requirement was formalized. Bennett would have to repay the diverted funds, though no one believed he could do so quickly. He lost any role in purchasing, any ability to authorize spending, any claim to vendor independence. Father made it clear that if he remained in the family business at all, it would be under strict supervision and with none of the responsibilities he had abused. For a while, Bennett did not speak to me. That would have been easier if I had not had to see him in the same family spaces. But the truth of a family business is that even after a betrayal, birthdays still happen, meals still happen, and parents still hope enough can be patched to preserve the appearance of a whole unit. I did not want to perform that kind of peace. At one dinner, after too much silence and too much food left untouched, Bennett finally tried. "I didn't want it to go this far," he said, looking at his plate instead of at me. I set down my fork. Mother, who had remained quiet through the entire meal, lifted her eyes with obvious tension. She had been devastated by the whole thing, but had mostly tried to keep the household from becoming a battlefield. I said, "You came into Dad's office with a file naming me as the thief." Bennett exhaled sharply. I know. You knew it was a lie. He did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. I leaned back. Do you understand what that means? He looked up then, and for the first time since the confrontation, he looked less like the clever brother who had been managing a problem, and more like a frightened man who had finally realized the ground was gone under him. I was drowning, he said, so you decided to throw me under. He flinched. Mother closed her eyes briefly, as if the table itself had become too heavy to bear. Bennett said, I thought if I could stabilize the store, I could fix my debt later. I laughed once without humor. You didn't stabilize anything. You destabilized the entire family. He had no answer for that. And the worst part was that I believed him when he said he had been drowning. I believed the debt was real. I believed the pressure had been real. I believed the panic had been real. What I did not forgive was the choice he made once he realized he might lose control. People reveal their character in the story they choose when there is still time to tell the truth. He chose a lie. Cornelius called me a few days later to wrap up a few final questions, and in the end he said something that stayed with me. This kind of situation happens more often than people think, he said. Not the exact same facts, but the same structure. Shared business, family roles, one person with financial trouble, another person who becomes the scapegoat. The person who created the mess often understands the system well enough to weaponize it. I asked him, why is it always so personal? He was quiet for a second before answering. Because business fraud is usually about opportunity, he said, but family fraud is about trust. Opportunity can be traced. Trust is harder to rebuild. That was the sentence that explained why the whole thing hurt so much longer than the legal paperwork should have allowed. It was not only that Bennett stole, it was that he stole from the family's trust in one of the family's own children. Months later, the store was still standing. Strong, even. Father made changes that should have been made earlier. He brought in tighter controls, dual approval for vendor payments, mandatory external reviews on larger invoices, clearer access limitations, more regular reconciliations. He also asked me to stay on as the primary bookkeeper, with expanded oversight and with Priscilla available for any legal or structural questions going forward. I said yes, not because it was easy, because leaving would have felt like surrendering the very part of the story Bennett had tried to steal from me. I wanted to keep my place in the business, but more than that, I wanted to prove to myself that one person's betrayal did not erase years of honest work. Father and I worked carefully after that. Our relationship was not fixed overnight. Some wounds leave a visible seam no matter how much time passes. But he stopped making assumptions about what silence meant. I stopped pretending I was invulnerable to being hurt by his doubt. We learned, slowly and awkwardly, to speak before resentment had time to calcify. As for Bennett, what remained of our relationship never returned to what it had been. Family members kept asking whether we would reconcile. Some wanted a dramatic forgiveness scene, as if one apology could fold a betrayal neatly back into place. But forgiveness is not the same as restoration, and trust is not a switch you flip because everyone feels exhausted by the damage. I do not hate him. That would be easier in some ways. Hate is simple. It gives the pain a single shape. What I feel instead is a colder, more difficult truth. He chose to protect himself by sacrificing me. He knew our father's values. He knew my role. He knew exactly how much harm he was inflicting, and he did it anyway because he believed the lie would buy him time. That knowledge changes the shape of a sibling relationship forever. The last time I spoke with Cornelius after the case closed, he told me something that stayed with me for a different reason. You did the right thing by demanding an independent audit, he said. I gave him a tired smile. I didn't see any other option. Most people don't, he replied. They react to the accusation. You responded to the system. That was kind of him, but I think the truth was simpler. I could not afford to trust my own outrage alone. I needed evidence because evidence was the only thing strong enough to survive the family story Bennett had already built around me. And that is what saved me. Not anger, not pleading, not even father's eventual apology. The audit saved me. Marisol's investigation saved me. The decision to treat the accusation like a financial crime instead of a personal insult saved me. Sometimes the truth does not arrive as a revelation. Sometimes it arrives as a spreadsheet, a vendor email, and the patient work of someone willing to check every line. If Bennett had confessed when the debt first became dangerous, we might have had a different life after all this. If he had asked for help, father might have been furious, but he would have helped. If he had admitted he was failing instead of building a case case against me. The store would have absorbed the shock and moved on with far less damage. Instead, he chose the path that offered him temporary cover and permanent destruction. That is what I remember most clearly now. Not the folder. Not the office. Not even the moment Father looked at the documents and understood. I remember the exact instant I realized Bennett was willing to let the family believe I had stolen from us. That was the real theft. Money can be repaid, eventually, with enough discipline and enough sacrifice. But trust, once spent that way, is far harder to restore. And my brother knew it. He counted on it. He counted on me being too shocked to fight back with strategy. He counted on Father trusting appearances. He counted on the store's paperwork being complicated enough to bury the truth. He was wrong. In the end, the numbers told the story he could not control, and the story they told was the one he had spent weeks trying to hide. He had stolen from the family business to cover his own debts. Then he tried to pin it on me, and because we treated the accusation seriously enough to investigate it properly, the lie did not survive contact with the records.